There is a place along the Scioto River where the land remembers, where the soil holds the shape of hands that worked it 2,000 years ago, where the geometry of the earth itself speaks of something far older than memory.
And if you walk inside those earthen walls at the right hour, just as the light softens over the valley, you may find yourself wondering whether the silence is emptiness or whether it is something else entirely.
This is Mound City, and this is Whispers of Southern Ohio. I'm your host, Chloe, and welcome to Whispers of Southern Ohio, the show that wanders deep into the stories, the legends, and the living landscape of one of the most storied regions in America. Today, we're talking about Mound City, one of the most remarkable ceremonial sites left on this continent, and I have the perfect person to walk me through it. Mark H. Rowe is an author, a researcher, and a fellow traveler in the stories of this land. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Chloe, it is always a privilege, and Mound City, I have to say, it is one of those subjects I keep coming back to. Every time I think I've said what I need to say about it, the place surprises me again.
That's exactly the feeling I get every time I look at what those people left behind. There is something in the geometry itself, in the way those mounds are laid out, that just doesn't let you look away.
It's magnetic. That's the only word that really fits.
So let's set the scene for our listeners. Mound City sits in Ross County, Ohio, right along the banks of the Scioto River. For anyone who hasn't been there, can you paint a picture of what you're looking at when you arrive?
Sure, you're driving through farmland. Very flat, very green, the kind of landscape that feels quietly ancient even before you know what's there. And then you come around a bend, and there it is. A large, roughly rectangular earthwork enclosure, about 13 acres enclosed inside walls of compacted earth, and within those walls, more than 20 dozen burial mounds.
24 mounds all inside one geometric enclosure. How precise is the geometry? I mean, people talk about the accuracy of these earthworks, and it almost sounds impossible given the time period.
It sounds impossible until you stand inside it and actually look at it. The Hopewell, and we're talking roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE, they were doing something that we don't fully understand in terms of methodology. The enclosure walls at Mound City are remarkably straight. The corners hold angles that shouldn't be achievable without surveying equipment. And yet, there it is, built in an era without metal tools, without the wheel, without writing as we understand it.
Which raises the question that I always come back to. Why? Why build with this level of precision for a burial site? What were they trying to accomplish?
And that's where it gets deeply interesting. The prevailing interpretation, and I think it's the right one, is that Mound City wasn't primarily a burial site in the way we think of cemeteries. It was a ceremonial center, a place of transformation. The burial of the dead was part of that ceremony, but it was embedded in something much larger, a world view that understood death as passage, as movement, as transition from one state of being into another.
And the geometry was part of that worldview.
The geometry was essential to it. There's evidence that many of these Hopewell earthworks, not just at Mound City, but across the Scioto Valley, encode alignments with celestial events, solstice sunrises, lunar standstills. The relationship between the geometry of the earth and the movements of the sky was not incidental. It was deliberate. It was theological.
That takes my breath away every time I hear it. You're standing in a place that ancient people used to mark their position in the cosmos. That's not just archaeology, that's almost philosophy made visible.
That is exactly what it is. And Mound City is one of the places where that philosophy is most legible. When you look at the mounds within the enclosure, and there were originally thought to be 23, each one appears to have served a slightly different ceremonial purpose. Some contained cremation basins. Some held offerings of extraordinary craftsmanship, copper ear spools, platform pipes carved in the shape of animals, sheets of mica cut into geometric forms, objects that had traveled hundreds of miles from their origins.
That trade network, the Hopewell interaction sphere, is something I find endlessly fascinating. Can you talk a little about what it means that these objects came from so far away? Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Carolinas, obsidian from Yellowstone?
It tells us that Mound City and the Scioto Valley centers in general were not isolated communities scratching out an existence on the frontier.
They were the nodes of an enormous network, a spiritual and economic web that stretched across what is now the eastern half of the continent. People came here, or their goods did, and those goods were placed inside these mounds as offerings, which tells you that this place carried meaning not just locally, but across vast distances. It was a sacred center on a continental scale.
A spiritual hub.
A spiritual hub, one of the most powerful ones we know of in all of pre-Columbian North America.
I want to stay with that phrase for a moment, spiritual hub, because I think people sometimes hear about ancient peoples and imagine small, disconnected bands of survivors. But what you're describing is something much more organized, much more intentional.
Much more intentional, and the intentionality shows in the objects they left behind. Consider the effigy pipes found at Mound City. Some of these are astonishing works of naturalistic sculpture: a hawk, a beaver, a bear, each one carved with an understanding of form and proportion that rivals any artistic tradition you care to name. These weren't crude fetish objects. They were sacred instruments made by people who understood what they were doing.
And then, this is the part of the story that always gives me a complicated feeling, the site was almost erased completely. Can you talk about what happened during World War I?
Yes, and I think it's important to sit with the weight of this. In 1917, the United States Army established Camp Sherman on the land that includes Mound City, and the construction of that camp essentially leveled the site. The mounds were graded down, the enclosure walls were pushed aside, buildings went up, roads were cut through. In a period of months, something that had survived 15 centuries was effectively destroyed.
15 centuries and gone in months.
Gone in months. And what makes it even more painful is that the people at the time knew what was there. There had been archaeological work at Mound City. The mounds had been documented, and still the decision was made. The camp needed the land, and the land was taken.
And yet, the site was eventually recovered, restored. That story of rediscovery is remarkable in its own right.
It is. After Camp Sherman was decommissioned following the war, there was an effort, slow and imperfect but sincere, to understand what had been there. Researchers sifted through the disturbed soil, maps and earlier accounts were consulted, and over the course of the 20th century, the earthwork enclosure was rebuilt. The walls were reconstructed to approximate their original form. The site became part of the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, which now encompasses several of these earthwork complexes across the Scioto Valley.
So in a sense, the physical structure you walk through today is a reconstruction, but the sacred ground underneath, the soil that holds all of that ceremony and intention, that remains.
The soil remains. And I think that's where the power of the place comes from, not from the reconstructed walls, as meaningful as they are, but from the ground itself, the earth that was shaped and used and consecrated by people who believed in what they were doing.
I want to ask you about something that visitors often mention when they talk about Mound City, a feeling, something that's hard to put into words. Have you experienced that?
I have, and I'll tell you, I don't reach easily for supernatural explanations. I tend to approach these things with a certain amount of skepticism, but standing inside that enclosure, particularly in the late afternoon when the shadows start to lengthen and the Scioto is catching light off to the west, there is something there, a quality of attention that the place seems to demand, a sense that you are not alone with just the wind and the grass.
Watchers. Some of the old traditions speak of guardians tied to sacred sites, ancestral presences. Not ghosts exactly, but something more like a continuing awareness, a consciousness of the land itself.
Yes, and in many indigenous traditions connected to this landscape, and I want to be careful here because these traditions belong to living peoples and deserve to be held with respect, there is a strong sense that the ancestors do not simply depart. They remain invested in the places where their most significant ceremonies were conducted, where their dead were laid to rest, where the cycle of passage was completed. Mound City would be one of those places.
I think about the Scioto River when you say that, the river that runs alongside this site. Rivers carry such weight in folklore. They're often seen as boundaries, thresholds between the living world and something else.
The Scioto has been that threshold for a very long time. It's one of the reasons the Hopewell chose this valley, I think. Waterways were corridors for trade, for movement, for people carrying ideas and sacred objects, but they were also liminal spaces. They marked the edge of the known and the beginning of something beyond knowing. Mound City sits right at that edge.
At dusk, I imagine it must feel almost unbearable in the best possible way.
At dusk in midsummer, with the fireflies coming up from the grass and the river going silver in the last light, it is one of the most affecting places I have ever stood, and I've stood in a lot of places. There is a stillness there that feels chosen, like the quiet itself was placed there deliberately.
Why geometry, though? Of all the ways the Hopewell could have expressed their theology, through stories, through songs, through material culture, why did they choose to carve it into the earth in lines and angles and circles? Why geometry?
I think about this a lot, and my best answer is that geometry was the language they trusted most. Stories can be misremembered, songs change in the singing, but a line of earth, a wall at a precise angle to the rising sun, that holds its meaning as long as the wall holds. Geometry was their most durable form of inscription. They wrote their theology into the landscape in a form that was meant to last forever.
Meant to last forever. And in the face of everything that happened, the centuries of abandonment, the farming over, the military construction, parts of it did.
Parts of it did, and I find that deeply moving. Not because it represents conquest over time, but because it suggests that meaning is harder to destroy than matter. They built those earthworks with intentions so strong that the intention itself survived even when the structures didn't.
That is beautifully said. When I stand inside Mound City and try to imagine what a ceremony might have felt like, hundreds of people gathered, fires burning, the geometry of the enclosure holding everything in its shape, it's almost too much to hold in the mind.
It is overwhelming, because what you're imagining isn't just a ritual event. You're imagining a moment when a community was fully present to its own existence, when everything, the living and the dead, the earth and the sky, the near and the far, was gathered into one place, one geometry, one act of meaning-making.
That's what ceremony does, isn't it? It makes the invisible visible, for a little while at least.
For a little while, and then the fire goes out, and the people go home, and what remains is the shape that was left in the earth, waiting for the next ceremony, waiting for the next generation to come and understand it in their own way.
I want to bring this home a little to what Mound City means here and now in Ross County in southern Ohio, because I think there's sometimes a gap between what archaeologists understand about the Hopewell and what ordinary people feel when they drive past a mound or grow up next to one. What does that inheritance look like on the ground?
It's complicated, and it's rich. On one hand, you have the official, historical, and scientific narrative, the National Park Service, the interpretive centers, the scholarly work that has been done here. That story is important and largely accurate. But alongside it, there is another layer, a folk layer, the stories that don't make it into the brochures.
The stories that get passed down in family kitchens.
Exactly. The grandmother who told you never to take stones from the mounds, the farmer who stopped plowing a certain corner of his field because of what he felt there, the child who grew up hearing that the hills in this county were not natural, that they were made by people who had power that we no longer understand.
There's a kind of superstition that attaches itself to these places, and I don't mean that dismissively. Superstition is sometimes the folk memory of something that was once understood more formally.
That's a profound point, and I think it's right. When people in Ross County say they feel uneasy near a mound, when they sense something watching, something attentive, they may be responding to a reality that the Hopewell themselves encoded into the site. The sacred doesn't simply evaporate when the civilization that created it passes on. It lingers. It takes different forms. It becomes superstition or folklore, or a feeling that you can't quite name.
And I think that's part of what makes southern Ohio such a rich landscape for these kinds of conversations. There is something in this valley, something in the relationship between the land and the people who have lived on it, generation after generation, that keeps the old stories alive. They don't quite die here.
They don't, and Mound City is the heart of that.
When you understand that this place was once the center of a spiritual network that stretched across a continent, when you understand the magnitude of what was done here, it changes the way you look at the whole region. Every mound you see becomes part of a larger story. Every river, every ridge, every field where the soil runs darker than it should, it all becomes part of the Hopewell inheritance.
An inheritance that Ross County is still living with, still figuring out how to carry.
Still figuring out how to carry. And that, I think, is exactly as it should be. These things should take a long time to understand. They were made by people who were thinking on long scales of time. It would be strange if we had figured them out already.
Mark, I could talk to you about this forever. Thank you for bringing so much richness and care to this story. Mound City deserves exactly this kind of attention.
Thank you, Chloe. Truly. This place, this whole valley, deserves every bit of attention we can give it, and more. Thank you for joining me on Whispers of Southern Ohio. If you'd like to explore more of my work, you can follow me on my Amazon author page at amazon.com/author/Mark H. Rowe, and visit me at markhrowe.com for more stories, books, and updates. Until next time, keep your lantern close and your curiosity closer.